For 6 years, I tried. I really did. Every Christmas, I walked into Callum's family home hoping maybe this year would be different. That Margaret would look me in the eye like I wasn't a stray picked up off the side of the road. That Lydia and Janelle would include me in their sisterly banter without tossing me a look that said, "Why are you even here?" Every holiday season I stitched up the same worn-out hope, dressed it up in red and gold, and brought it with me like a casserole dish. But each year, the answer was always the same. I didn't belong. Not really. I remember the first year clearly. Callum and I had only been married a few months. I wore a forest green sweater dress and brought a homemade cheesecake I'd stayed up all night baking. I'd wanted to impress them, prove I was more than just the woman who took Callum away from his childhood traditions. But when we arrived, Margaret barely looked up from her crystal glass. Lydia and Janelle were wrapped in their own world of stories and giggles and remember-when tales. I hovered near the fireplace, smiling like an idiot, waiting for someone to ask me about my life. No one did. That year set the tone. The Christmas photo? I was asked to take it. Stockings? They hung with every family member's name in embroidered thread, except mine. I got a plain red one. Not even a tag. Margaret said they'd run out of letters. And Callum? He'd shrug it off, say, "They're just used to a rhythm. Babe, don't take it personally." But I did. Every time. Year after year, it was the same cycle. I showed up. They tolerated me. I smiled through tight cheeks and dry wine, ignored the inside jokes I wasn't part of, watched them pass gifts around like sacred relics while mine sat unopened until someone remembered. If they remembered. I learned how to disappear in plain sight. To nod politely when they forgot my birthday. To laugh when Margaret told her friends I worked in something artsy. I'm an architect. She never cared to know that. But this year, I wasn't coming as the quiet, gracious wife anymore. This year, I wasn't bringing a dessert or another polite smile. This year, I brought the truth. It had taken 12 months of quiet planning. Each passive-aggressive comment, every smirk and snub, had fueled me. I didn't need revenge, not exactly. I needed freedom. I needed closure. And if I had to earn it at the cost of their perfect little holiday, so be it. I started small, slipping away after dinner to make phone calls, chatting with former employees of Margaret's boutique catering business, visiting the courthouse to dig through public records, requesting financial documents anonymously. It became my little project, one they never noticed, because they never saw me. Invisible people make the best spies. There were late nights when I'd sit at my kitchen table, a glass of red wine in one hand and a spreadsheet in the other, piecing together Margaret's paper trail. It wasn't hard, really. She was arrogant. Sloppy. Hiding in plain sight just like me. Unreported earnings. Under-the-table payments. Shell accounts. She even used her grandson's college fund to buy a second oven she wrote off as equipment. The audacity made me laugh. I never told Callum. I wanted to. But every time I tried, he brushed me off. Said I was reading too much into things. That his mother loved me in her own way. She's just tough, he said. It's how she shows affection. I stopped explaining. I stopped asking for backup. Eventually, I stopped asking for him. As December crept in, I wrapped the evidence in gold foil and tied it with red ribbon. It looked festive. Cheerful, even. Inside, the truth waited like a ticking clock. The week before Christmas, I rehearsed my lines in the mirror. Not because I needed them, but because I wanted to deliver them just right. Calm. Steady. Not angry, not bitter, just done. That's the thing about dignity. It doesn't shout. It doesn't beg. It simply walks in and sits down at the table like it belongs. When Christmas morning arrived, I put on a dress that made me feel strong, midnight blue with a sharp collar and sleeves that framed my arms like armor. I curled my hair and wore a single gold pendant that had belonged to my grandmother. She'd always said, "Never let them dim your shine, darling." Especially not in their house. I looked at myself one last time and nodded. As we drove to Westridge, Callum hummed along to the carols playing on the radio. He was excited. Blissfully unaware. I stared out the window, watching the frost collect on the glass, thinking about how many versions of myself I'd left behind in that house. The eager newlywed. The hopeful outsider. The silent observer. None of them were coming with me this year. When we pulled into the long driveway, the estate sparkled like something out of a holiday card. Every bush was lit. Every wreath was coordinated. The house glowed with curated charm. But underneath it all, I could feel the tension humming like an old piano string, ready to snap. Callum stepped out, brushing snow from his coat. "You okay?" he asked, glancing back at me. I smiled. Never better. Inside, the familiar routine unfolded. Margaret kissed Callum's cheek like he was royalty. Lydia squealed and wrapped her arms around him. Janelle offered him bourbon. And me? I got a nod. A polite smile. As if I were someone's assistant dropping off a casserole. I smiled back. Because they didn't know. Not yet. Later, as we sat around the fire, Margaret's voice rang out in that sing-song way she used when she wanted attention. This year, I thought we'd do something special after dinner. She beamed at her daughters. A Christmas blessings ceremony. Of course she did. I let the words wash over me, like water on glass. It was almost time. 6 years of exile. 6 years of sitting on the edge of family portraits, of being skipped over in favor of dogs and distant cousins. 6 years of watching Callum turn a blind eye. But this year, I brought a gift of my own. Wrapped in gold. Tied with ribbon. And full of the kind of truth that doesn't just sit quietly in the corner. It changes everything. The Westridge estate came into view like some snow-covered hallucination, glowing against the gray December sky. Margaret's house wasn't just decorated, it was staged. Each evergreen garland aligned with surgical precision, white twinkling lights that flickered in perfect rhythm. The oversized wreath on the double front doors looked like it had been commissioned for a magazine spread. There wasn't a pine needle out of place. I had always thought it was a bit much, a Christmas pageant disguised as a family gathering, but this year it felt different. This year I wasn't here to smile and endure. This year I came to end the performance. Callum's hands gripped the steering wheel, his fingers tapping nervously as we pulled up the circular driveway. "She really went all out this year," he muttered, giving a low whistle. "Even the reindeer in the yard have scarves." "They had scarves last year," I replied, keeping my voice light. He didn't notice the edge under it. He never did. We stepped out of the car and the cold smacked me with clarity. I paused for a second, letting the winter air settle my nerves. I smoothed my coat, checked the box tucked under my arm, gold paper, red ribbon, just the right weight, and followed Callum up the stone steps. The front doors burst open before we could even knock. Lydia flew out like a Christmas tornado, her arms flung wide, laughter already bubbling from her lips. "Oh my God, Callum." Finally, she shouted, throwing herself onto her brother like they hadn't spoken 3 times that morning. Janelle appeared behind her, more restrained but beaming. "You look good, big brother," she said, pulling him into a tight hug. "And me?" I got the nod. Not a hug, not even a "Merry Christmas." Just that shallow dip of the chin, that tight, professional smile that said, "We see you, but we're not really looking." Callum barely noticed. He was too busy getting swept inside by his sisters, his laughter joining theirs like music in a house that had no room for other melodies. I lingered at the threshold for a beat longer, the cold nipping at my heels. Then I stepped into the curated warmth of Westridge, closing the door behind me. Inside, the house smelled like pine, cinnamon, and performative perfection. A fire crackled in the grand hearth, casting a soft glow over the pristine cream and gold living room. The tree, 15 feet tall and dusted with artificial snow, stood like a monument to Margaret's taste. Every ornament matched. There wasn't a smudge, a wrinkle, a single object out of line. It looked like a showroom, not a home. And yet, this was where we were supposed to gather, to feel, what? Togetherness? Belonging? Margaret descended the staircase like a queen entering court, her red silk blouse perfectly tucked, not a hair out of place. "Darling," she called to Callum, arms opening. "Look at you." She kissed both his cheeks, then looked over his shoulder at me. "You made it," she said flatly. "Not good to see you. Not you look lovely. Just that, you made it." As if she had lost a bet. "I did," I said, meeting her eyes. Her gaze flicked down to the box in my arms. "Oh, and gifts already?" she asked with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Just one," I replied smoothly. "For later." She hummed, uninterested, and turned back to Callum. "Come. We've got cider ready, and I made your favorite duck à l'orange." I slipped off my coat and followed them into the main sitting room. As always, there were 12 seats arranged in a perfect circle around the tree. 11 of them were clearly labeled with custom place cards in Margaret's sweeping calligraphy. The 12th had none. Guess which one was mine? I took my usual place on the edge, next to the potted poinsettia, just far enough to be in the photo, but always slightly cropped when Margaret shared them on social media. I'd learned to sit tall and smile like I wasn't aware of it. The afternoon passed in a blur of polite conversation and forced laughter. Janelle showed off pictures of her latest vacation in Santorini. Lydia bragged about her new yoga certification. Margaret told everyone about her intimate dinner party for 42 guests, casually name-dropping the city councilman. I contributed only when spoken to, which wasn't often. But beneath my calm surface, I was watching everything. I watched how Margaret patted Callum's hand with pride, how her voice brightened when she mentioned him. I watched how Lydia looped her arm through his like they were still teenagers at the family cabin. I watched how Janelle filled his glass before her own. They loved him. They idolized him. And they never truly believed I deserved him. Callum, as always, tried to play peacekeeper. He glanced at me a few times, offering soft smiles, silent apologies he wouldn't say out loud. But it was too late for that. You can only be a ghost at your own holiday so many times before you start to haunt back. As the sun dipped below the frosted hills and the windows darkened into mirrors, Margaret stood with a delicate clink of her dessert spoon against her glass. "Everyone," she announced, "dinner is nearly ready. But before that, we'll gather for something very special." She grinned. "This year, I've planned something new. A Christmas blessings ceremony." The room buzzed with interest. Janelle leaned forward. Lydia clapped softly. Even Robert, Margaret's husband, looked up from his tablet. Margaret turned to Callum. "You'll love it, darling. It's all about honoring what matters most." I smiled to myself, fingers brushing the edge of the ribbon on the box at my side. How poetic, I thought. Honoring what matters. If only they knew how much truth they were about to unwrap. Because this year, I wasn't here to blend into the background or pretend I didn't notice. I wasn't here to smile and be grateful for scraps of attention. I wasn't here to survive another lonely holiday in a room full of people who would never choose me. I was here to end the performance. To return the favor. And the curtain was just about to rise. Dinner was a spectacle. Of course it was. Margaret would never allow anything less than immaculate. The long mahogany table glistened under the crystal chandelier, each place setting meticulously arranged with gold-rimmed china and perfectly folded napkins that looked more like origami sculptures than fabric. A garland of holly and eucalyptus trailed down the center, peppered with golden candlesticks that flickered like stage lights. It didn't feel like a family meal. It felt like a performance. And every seat held a well-rehearsed actor, except mine. Callum sat to Margaret's right, as always, laughing a little too hard at her dry jokes, accepting second helpings of duck like a prince being fed by a loyal court. Lydia and Janelle flanked him, beaming and buzzing like matching satellites in his orbit. Their voices filled the space, a blend of nostalgia and curated happiness, sprinkled with inside jokes I was never part of. I could anticipate every beat of their rhythm by now, their laughter, their feigned surprise, their well-timed compliments to their mother's culinary brilliance. And me? I was on the far end, just close enough to catch the drift of conversation, but far enough to be forgotten. No one passed me the potatoes until I asked twice. When I spoke, no one interrupted because no one responded. But I didn't mind this time. I chewed slowly. Watched. Waited. When the plates were cleared and the air thickened with the scent of cinnamon coffee and expensive peppermint bark, Margaret rose to her feet, lifting her glass delicately. "Everyone," she said, in that perfectly projected tone that silenced the room without needing to raise her voice, "I thought this year deserved something extra special." Lydia clapped softly. Janelle tilted her head with interest. Callum gave a small nod. Margaret continued. "We've had our share of challenges. This family has seen some storms, but we're here. Together. And that, my darlings, deserves celebration." A few hears echoed through the room, and Margaret beamed, savoring her moment. She turned to the grand cabinet behind her, opening its ornate doors to reveal a stack of elegantly wrapped packages. She clapped once. "Welcome," she said dramatically, "to the very first North Pole presentation." A few chuckles rose from the table. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "One by one," Margaret continued, "we will present our blessings, tokens of love and gratitude. I'll go first, of course." She pulled a sleek silver box from the stack and handed it to Lydia. "For my darling daughter. To remind you of your beauty and strength during these trying times." Lydia opened it with theatrical grace, revealing an embossed bottle of perfume nestled in velvet. "Chanel No. 5, she gasped. "Mother, you're ridiculous." "Oh, just a little token," Margaret said, waving it off. Next came Janelle's gift, a silk robe with her initials stitched in gold, accompanied by a spa voucher for a year of renewal. Robert received a leather watch that probably cost more than our wedding. Even the dogs got custom treat boxes labeled naughty and nice. And I waited. The last gift was handed out. Margaret glanced around dramatically, pretending to count. Then, as if suddenly remembering, she placed a hand to her chest. "Oh no," she said with an exaggerated laugh. "We forgot about you." Everyone laughed. Lydia snorted into her wine. Even Janelle giggled. And Callum, my husband, laughed too. Just a soft chuckle, but enough to turn my stomach. I looked at him. He didn't notice. Or maybe he pretended not to. It was always easier for him to look away. But I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I smiled calmly, my voice soft and steady as I reached beneath my chair. "That's okay," I said. "I didn't forget about you." The room quieted slightly. I stood and walked over to Margaret, placing a small, gold-wrapped box gently into her hands. "Oh," she said, surprised. "How thoughtful." I returned to my seat, folding my hands in my lap as she began to untie the red ribbon. There was something satisfying about the way her fingers faltered, just slightly. The paper came off slowly, and she opened the lid. She paused, pulled out a thick, neatly bound folder. For a moment, her expression didn't change. Then she glanced at the cover page. Her smile twitched. "What's this?" she asked, still trying to sound amused. "Just something I've been working on," I replied, watching her eyes flicker down the page. Silence. Real silence. The room, once filled with artificial cheer and designer perfume, went hollow. Lydia leaned forward. "Mom?" Margaret flipped to the second page. The color drained from her face. Receipts. Bank statements. Email printouts. Copies of vendor invoices. Notes in careful, organized handwriting. "What is that?" Janelle asked, her voice sharp now. Margaret didn't answer. Callum looked between us. "What's going on?" I spoke clearly so there would be no misunderstanding. "It's a record of Margaret's table and time. Specifically, all the income that was never reported. All the checks cashed under alternate names. The tax fraud. The pension transfers. The Shell catering accounts. The double bookings under her friend's business license." Lydia gasped. "Wait, what?" Janelle grabbed the folder and began reading. Her face went pale. Callum stood, his voice rising. "What the hell is this? Are you serious?" "She's been lying," I said, still calm. "To all of you. About the money. About being broke. About not being able to help when Lydia needed a loan. About not having the resources when Janelle's partner was laid off. All of it. Lies." Margaret finally found her voice. This This is absurd. This is an attack. Is it? I ask softly. Or is it just the truth wrapped with ribbon and hand-delivered, like everything else in this house? She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Callum looked down at me, stunned. You did this? I looked at him, then at the family who had spent 6 years pretending I didn't exist. You all wanted a perfect Christmas, I said. But I thought it was time we unwrapped something real. Robert took the folder next, eyes scanning the pages with shaking hands. This can't be right, he murmured. But I knew he saw it. It was right. It was all right there. And for the first time in 6 years, every single person in that room looked at me. Not through me. Not around me. At me. Because now, they couldn't ignore me. I wasn't invisible anymore. The folder sat in Robert's trembling hands like a live wire. Its edges were sharp from the dozens of copied documents I'd trimmed and hole-punched myself over the last year. He didn't speak as he flipped the pages, his reading glasses slowly sliding down his nose. His face had gone an unnatural shade of grayish pink, and I watched the slow crumble of a man who thought he knew everything about his wife. Margaret stood beside him, rigid as marble. Her arms were crossed now, the box abandoned on the table next to a half-eaten macaron. She said nothing as he read. Not a denial. Not a protest. Nothing. Just a frozen mask stretched across her face, a performance on pause. Lydia broke the silence first. Her voice cracked. What the hell is this? I leaned back slightly in my chair, legs crossed, keeping my expression neutral. I had prepared for this moment, envisioned it 1,000 ways, some more dramatic than others, but what I hadn't predicted was how utterly quiet it would be. There was no yelling yet. No accusations. Just the slow, dawning realization that their carefully curated world was about to collapse. Janelle reached across the table and took a few pages from her father's stack. Her brows furrowed as she skimmed. Are these bank transfers? To her personal account, I replied. Hidden through a secondary PayPal under the name T and Time 2. She used it to process bookings, then filtered the money into a private fund. Untaxed. Lydia blinked, then looked at her mother like she was seeing her for the first time. You said you were broke. Margaret finally moved. She tilted her chin and exhaled slowly, her voice taut with false dignity. That was a complicated time. You told me you couldn't help with the divorce lawyer, Lydia continued, her voice rising. I had to drain my own savings. You let me believe. I had to protect our assets, Margaret cut in sharply, snapping the words like branches. It was temporary. You let me borrow money from Janelle, Lydia whispered, shaking her head. And you had all this? This stash? She told me she was downsizing for retirement, Janelle said flatly. Said it wasn't the right time to ask for help when Aaron lost his job. The folder made a soft thump as Robert dropped it onto the table. His hands shook as he reached for the final page, the one I'd carefully labeled pension disbursements and unauthorized withdrawals. That page was the linchpin. The one that tied everything together. Margaret had been siphoning money from their joint retirement account for nearly 3 years, enough to bankroll a lifestyle she told everyone she'd sacrificed. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, You drained my pension. Margaret turned toward him, her face pinched. I had no choice. No choice. His voice cracked. You used the same account I spent 35 years building. She crossed her arms again. You wouldn't understand. I was protecting us. I kept the business afloat. I had to make certain decisions without burdening you. You lied to me, Robert said, his voice now louder. To all of us. Callum stood behind his chair like a man balancing on thin ice. His eyes hadn't left mine since I first handed the box to Margaret, but now they flicked to his mother, to his sisters, to the folder. I could see the war inside him, the reflex to defend his family, the loyalty twisting against the weight of evidence. You've been watching us struggle, Lydia said, standing now, her voice shaking. And you just... what? Kept cashing checks? Pretended you didn't have anything to give. I earned every penny, Margaret snapped. No, you didn't, I cut in softly. You hid it. You defrauded vendors. You lied to your clients. You committed tax evasion. This isn't about what you earned. It's about what you stole. Her head snapped toward me. Don't act like you're some noble crusader. You're not family. You never have been. And there it was. The truth behind every cold glance. Every forgotten invitation. Every seat too far from the center of the room. I looked her dead in the eye. No. I was never part of your little kingdom. And thank God for that. She started to speak again, but then Robert let out a sudden, wheezing breath and collapsed sideways in his chair. Dad, Callum shouted, diving forward. The room exploded. Chairs screeched across the hardwood. Lydia screamed. Janelle rushed to her father's side, hands fumbling to check his pulse. Margaret stood frozen in place, her mouth open but silent, unmoving. Call 911. I barked, already grabbing my phone. My fingers flew across the screen as I gave the dispatcher the address. He's conscious, but unresponsive, pulse is weak, possibly cardiac. I crouched beside Robert, taking in his ashen face and the glisten of sweat forming on his forehead. He blinked up at me once. You knew, he whispered. You knew what she was doing. I did, I said quietly. And I'm sorry I had to show you like this. But you deserve to know. The wail of sirens in the distance signaled the approaching ambulance. Lydia met my eyes across the room, her face streaked with tears, and I could see it, the fear, the betrayal, the unraveling of everything she thought was stable. Janelle cradled her father's head in her lap, whispering, "It's okay, Daddy." "You're okay?" Callum stood over us, his jaw tight. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said to me, low and furious. "Because you never listened," I replied. "Because every time I tried to bring up how your family treated me, you told me to let it go. To not take it personally." "This is personal, Callum. She's still my mother," he said. "And I'm your wife. Or I was." The front door burst open and the EMTs rushed in, taking over with practiced urgency. Robert was loaded onto a stretcher, still breathing, still with us. But something had broken. I could see it in his eyes. In the eyes of everyone in that room. And Margaret just stood there, unmoved, untouched, hands clenching her silk blouse like it might shield her from the fallout. She never touched her husband. Never asked if he'd be okay. Not once. She only looked at the folder, still open on the table, and I watched the truth settle over her like ash. She knew what she had done. But more importantly, so did everyone else. For a few seconds after the ambulance pulled away, no one spoke. The wailing sirens faded into the cold night air, but their echoes seemed to linger in the grand halls of the Westridge estate. Margaret stood in the foyer, still dressed in her crimson blouse, a crystal goblet clutched in her hand. Not to drink, just something to hold, as if the fragile glass might tether her to reality. Lydia and Janelle were huddled on the couch, whispering in urgent, confused bursts. Callum paced in a narrow line near the fireplace, his footsteps the only sound, like a metronome ticking off the end of the illusion. The dossier still sat on the table. Open. Exposed. Its pages fluttered slightly whenever someone moved past, as though it were breathing. Or bleeding. I remained where I had stood moments earlier, still in my place, unmoved. But I was no longer the outsider. I wasn't waiting for inclusion. I wasn't begging to be seen. Now they were all looking. They couldn't not look. "I don't understand," Lydia finally said, her voice hushed but angry. "How long has this been happening?" "Years? You said you were broke, Mom. You said we had to cut corners." Margaret's lip trembled slightly, but not with emotion. For her, this was strategy. She was gauging how much sympathy still remained in the room. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said at last, her voice cracking in just the right places. "You have to understand, I was protecting what we built. Your father, he wasn't paying attention. Someone had to manage things. I never used the money recklessly." Janelle snapped her head toward her. "You bought a vacation home in Sonoma." Margaret waved her off. "That was an investment. I hosted a networking retreat there." "You said we couldn't afford groceries when Aaron lost his job," Janelle barked. "You made me feel guilty for asking for help. And the whole time, you were siphoning money. Margaret turned away, walking slowly to the fireplace as though trying to find comfort in the warmth. You're exaggerating. It's not like I did anything criminal. Creative bookkeeping isn't exactly unusual in our line of work. You falsified documents, I said calmly. You created a shell PayPal account. You defrauded vendors by charging luxury rates while skimming from the top. That's not creative bookkeeping, Margaret. That's fraud. The room fell silent again. Then Lydia stood, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. You lied to us. You let me crawl through my divorce with nothing. I had to borrow from my friends to pay for the settlement. And all this time, you were sitting on a pile of hidden money. Margaret's shoulders tensed, but she said nothing. She couldn't argue with hard numbers. She couldn't spin bank statements or invent explanations for missing pension withdrawals. The truth was written in plain ink, and everyone in the room had read it. Callum, who had stayed mostly quiet since the paramedics left, finally turned to face me. His eyes were dark, uncertain, wounded in that way that made me wonder whether he was grieving the loss of family or the loss of the fantasy they'd all clung to. You planned this, he said softly, as though trying to make sense of something grotesque. You knew what would happen if you did this tonight. I nodded. I did. Why tonight? He asked. Why Christmas? I looked around at the glittering lights, the designer ornaments, the immaculately wrapped gifts that now felt like props in a stage play. Because this is the only night when everyone shows up. When you're all finally in the same room. And because, after 6 years of being excluded, ignored, and dismissed, this was the one night your mother couldn't avoid me. I wanted the truth to be unwrapped, just like every other perfectly presented package she's so carefully curated. He stared at me. You wanted to destroy this. No, I said. I wanted to stop pretending. There's a difference. Behind me, I heard Janelle scoff. You should have done it sooner. Margaret spun around. Oh, how convenient, she snapped. You're all just turning on me now? After everything I've done for this family? After the sacrifices? What sacrifices? Lydia shot back. You hoarded money while pretending to suffer. You lied to all of us for years. I kept this family together. Margaret shrieked, her composure shattering like glass dropped from a height. You have no idea what it's like to run a business, keep up appearances, manage a household. You mean keep up appearances, I cut in. That's what this has always been about for you. Margaret's gaze snapped to me like a whip. You don't get to speak here. Oh, but I do, I said evenly. I've earned it. Every moment I was overlooked, every photo I was cropped out of, every condescending remark you made while you smiled through your teeth, I took it all. I watched. I waited. And now? I've spoken. You don't have the power to silence me anymore. Her lip curled. What do you want? An apology? I shook my head. No. I want the consequences to start showing up. For once. At that, Robert's attorney, who I'd emailed the dossier to just an hour ago, would soon ensure it happened. The truth was already on its way to the right desks, the IRS, the State Tax Board, and the Business Bureau. I had learned how to use my invisibility as cover, and now my quiet had become their storm. Margaret must have sensed it. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, like she could outrun the fallout. You think you've won something? She spat. No, I replied, but I've ended something. Then something strange happened. Janelle walked over to me, not slowly, not timidly, but with purpose. She reached out and gripped my hand. Thank you, she said simply. I blinked at her, unsure how to respond. Lydia followed. Me too, she murmured. It's awful, but it's real. I didn't expect their gratitude. I didn't need it, but it landed like a bomb anyway, small, strange, and surprising. Margaret stood alone now, surrounded by golden ribbons and crumbling lies. Callum watched us all, his face a mixture of confusion and pain. He looked at me. You could have told me. I met his gaze. I tried. You just didn't want to hear it. He didn't argue. And that was when I knew, he might still love me, but he would never choose me. Not over the illusion. Not over them. A single sprig of mistletoe hung above Margaret's fireplace, trembling slightly in the draft of the vent. I stared at it for a moment. How ironic, that beneath the symbol of love, There was nothing but silence, betrayal, and the ruin of a carefully constructed lie. Mistletoe and mayhem. Maybe that was this year's theme. But for once, I wasn't the one being left out in the cold. Margaret was. The waiting room at Evergreen General smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. The kind of scent that stuck to your skin and made you feel like time had stopped moving altogether. Beige chairs lined the walls in stiff, uneven rows, and outdated magazines sat curled at the corners on low plastic tables. The hospital Christmas decorations felt like a cruel joke, sparkling snowflakes dangling from the ceiling, a paper tree pinned to the reception desk. Cheerful reminders of a holiday that had already collapsed under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Robert had been rushed through the double doors with a team of EMTs surrounding him, wires and monitors attached to his chest. A nurse had taken Margaret's name and asked her to wait. That was over 20 minutes ago. In that time, no one had said a word. Lydia sat hunched over her knees, eyes red, her freshly blown-out hair now a frizzed mess from her hands dragging through it over and over. Janelle stood near the vending machines, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her body swaying slightly like someone trying to self-soothe. And Callum. Callum was pacing again. 5 steps forward. Pivot. 5 steps back. His leather boots squeaked against the linoleum floor, an irritating rhythm I didn't bother asking him to stop. I sat in the farthest chair near the windows. The hospital parking lot looked bleak under the haze of cold fluorescent lights. Snow clung to the edges of the glass. In the distance, red and green lights blinked on top of the emergency entrance sign, flickering like they were shorting out. Fitting, really. A broken Christmas. Margaret stood alone. Not sitting, not pacing, just standing. Like a statue in that scarlet blouse of hers, arms crossed so tightly across her chest I half wondered if she'd folded herself shut. Her expression hadn't changed since the paramedics left. She hadn't cried. Hadn't reached for anyone. Not even once. But her eyes kept darting to the hallway as if she could will someone to emerge and tell her everything was still in her control. But it wasn't. Not anymore. I watched her carefully, noting how not once, not even in passing, had she asked if Robert would be okay. She hadn't held his hand as they loaded him into the ambulance. She hadn't whispered words of comfort or remorse. She had stood there, frozen. In shock, perhaps. Or maybe just exposed. When someone builds their life on a lie, it's not the truth that hurts, it's the silence that comes after it. Do you think he'll be all right? Lydia finally asked, her voice barely audible. Janelle turned toward her sister and shrugged, helpless. They said he was stable when they took him in. Margaret made a small sound at that, a sort of scoff hidden behind her teeth. I straightened. You don't believe them? I believe he's dramatic, she said flatly, like she was talking about a spoiled child, not the man she'd lived with for 35 years. He's always had a flair for collapsing when it's most inconvenient. The air went still. Lydia stared at her. He had a heart episode. And you think he did it for attention? Margaret finally met her daughter's gaze. Don't twist my words. I'm just saying your father has always had a weak constitution. This isn't the first time he's buckled under stress. Janelle moved closer, her voice low and even. He collapsed after finding out you drained his pension, Mother. Not because the duck was too dry. That silenced her. Callum walked over to me, not sitting, just hovering close. You could have warned us, he muttered. You could have said something before dumping all this tonight. I could have, I agreed. But you wouldn't have believed me. His jaw flexed. You've always had excuses for her, I continued. Every year I begged you to see it. To see me. And every time you told me to let it go. That I was reading too much into things. That she didn't mean it like that. He shifted uncomfortably, then finally sat beside me. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. I didn't want to believe it, he admitted. It was easier to pretend everything was fine. I nodded. That's what you all did. That's what she taught you to do. Another long pause settled between us. Across the room, Margaret had finally perched on the edge of a chair, stiff as ever, one manicured hand smoothing invisible wrinkles from her pants. Her eyes flicked between her daughters, like she was still plotting how to regain control. But it was too late. The power had shifted. The mirror she used to reflect perfection was shattered, and this room wasn't big enough for denial anymore. The double doors opened with a soft hiss, and a man in navy scrubs entered, his ID badge swinging from a lanyard as he walked. Family of Robert Whitmore? Everyone stood. The doctor gave a small smile. He's stable. He had a minor cardiac event, likely stress-induced. He's resting now, and we're running a full panel of tests to rule out deeper damage. But he's awake. Relief swept through the room, uneven but palpable. Lydia let out a breath she'd been holding. Janelle covered her face with her hands. Callum leaned back into his chair, eyes closing briefly. Margaret, however, barely reacted. "Can I see him?" she asked. The doctor hesitated. He asked not to see anyone yet. That landed like a slap. Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "I'm his wife." "I understand," the doctor said gently. "He requested privacy. He'll let us know when he's ready." A tremor passed through Margaret's lips. A single crack in the porcelain. Lydia stepped forward. "Did he say anything else?" The doctor gave her a soft look. Only that he needed space. And that someone gave him a gift worth more than anything he's ever unwrapped. He didn't have to say my name. Everyone turned to me, but I just exhaled slowly and said nothing. Margaret's shoulders fell. Her arms dropped. For the first time that night, she looked truly lost. Not furious. Not haughty. Just unmoored. And I realized something then. She wasn't afraid of losing Robert. She was afraid of losing control. Of the truth being bigger than her version of the story. The doctor left, promising an update soon. Callum stood again and looked at me. "What are you going to do now?" "I'm done pretending," I said simply. "That's all I ever wanted." He nodded slowly, but there was something final in it, something that neither of us said aloud. We weren't going back to the way things were. And I was finally okay with that. Because the storm had come and gone, and I was still standing. We returned to Westridge in silence. The snow had thickened during the hours at the hospital, blanketing the estate like it wanted to hide the cracks underneath. The house looked even more surreal than before, each hedge and tree dusted with icy powder, the warm glow from the windows casting long, deceptive shadows across the driveway. Callum's tires crunched slowly over the gravel. No one spoke. No one dared to fill the silence with words that might not land right. Inside, the warmth of the house felt almost offensive. The fireplace still burned. The air still smelled faintly of cinnamon and roasted duck, though both now seemed spoiled by everything that had unraveled. The wreath above the mantel was crooked, likely bumped during the earlier chaos, its ribbons sagging. Margaret noticed it immediately and walked over, adjusting it with shaking hands, as if restoring symmetry could rewind the evening. No one followed her. Lydia dropped her coat onto the nearest armchair without ceremony. Janelle kicked off her heels, rubbing her temples like she'd just survived a war zone. I remained by the door, unsure why I had returned at all. It wasn't my home. It never had been. But I supposed I wanted to see it one last time, with its gloss peeled back, its secrets scattered. The truth had already done what it came to do. But now came the aftermath. "You don't have to stay," Callum murmured beside me, his voice low. "You've made your point." I turned toward him. "You think this was about making a point?" His eyes, bloodshot from a combination of exhaustion and emotional whiplash, met mine. "Wasn't it?" I let the question hang there. Maybe part of me had wanted to prove something. To show them I wasn't invisible. That I'd been watching, listening, understanding more than they ever gave me credit for. But at the core of it, this was never about revenge, it was about release. The truth had always been heavier in silence, and I'd carried it long enough. "I stayed quiet for years," I said. "Because I thought if I tried harder, smiled wider, made myself smaller, I'd eventually be accepted. But that wasn't the test, Callum. The test was whether any of you would ever see me. And none of you did." He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Margaret returned from her wreath-adjusting ritual, her hands now busy with the fireplace mantel as she rearranged a porcelain angel figurine. She couldn't stop moving, couldn't stand the stillness that left her vulnerable. It was almost tragic, watching her grasp at control like a woman drowning in the very pool she filled. Lydia stood and walked to the table where the folder still rested, untouched since we'd left for the hospital. She opened it again, flipping through the pages with a mixture of awe and disgust. "I can't believe this was happening under our noses," she said. "I feel like an idiot." "You're not an idiot," I said softly. "You trusted her." Janelle walked over too, peering at one of the spreadsheets. "This is more than just hiding money. She manipulated all of us." "She did it for the family," Margaret said suddenly, her voice louder than it had been in hours. "I kept us together. You think any of you would have made it through those years without me holding the reins?" Lydia stared at her. "You think this is what holding the reins looks like?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "You all had what you needed. I made sacrifices. I did what I had to." "You lied," Janelle snapped. "You hoarded money while we struggled. You told us we were broke while you bought silk linens and designer wreaths. Do you even hear yourself?" "I am the reason this family has a reputation at all," Margaret replied, gesturing wildly. "Everything we have, this estate, our standing, I maintained it." "And at what cost?" Lydia asked. "You nearly gave Dad a heart attack. You ruined what was left of our trust. And now you expect what? Gratitude." Callum looked like he wanted to disappear. His sisters had never spoken to their mother like this before. But the spell was broken. The matriarch mask had cracked. And beneath it was just a woman who had built a house of cards and called it tradition. "I want an apology," Lydia said bluntly. "For lying. For making me feel like I was asking for too much when all I wanted was help." Janelle nodded. "Me too." Margaret's shoulders slumped. "You don't understand the pressure." "We don't want an excuse," Lydia cut in. "We want honesty." Margaret looked at them as if they'd betrayed her by demanding the one thing she had always refused to give. Silence fell again. Then Callum finally spoke. "Was this your plan?" he asked me, his voice sharper now. "To destroy Christmas? To destroy everything?" It stung more than I expected, even after everything. I looked at him, really looked. At the man I'd married. The man who had stood by and let me shrink year after year, holiday after holiday. The man who had never once said, "I see you." And I realized then he never would. My plan, I said, carefully choosing each word, was to finally say something when no one else would. If this destroyed everything, maybe it wasn't worth saving in the first place. He blinked, stunned. Margaret stepped forward. "Don't be dramatic. Families go through things. We recover." I shook my head. This wasn't just a bad moment. This was the moment when the curtain dropped. And you can't pretend anymore that this was a happy little show. Lydia looked between us, her eyes wide with the rawness of it all. "So what happens now?" I gave a small, sad smile. "That's up to all of you." But as I said it, I knew my decision was already made. I couldn't stay. Not here. Not with them. The damage wasn't just theirs, it had splintered into me over the years, leaving hairline cracks I'd patched with grace and patience. But this final fracture was clean. And in a strange way, it felt freeing. I reached into my coat pocket, fingers closing around my wedding ring. But not yet. Not tonight. One more night in this house, not as the invisible wife or the outsider under the mistletoe, but as the woman who told the truth. Who turned on the light. The truth was no longer mine to carry. Let them hold it now. Let them figure out what to do with the weight. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Westridge estate, falling in soft beams across the living room like it, too, was surveying the damage. The house looked different in the quiet of daylight, emptier, as though the shadows had finally slinked away and taken all the pretense with them. There was no music playing, no clinking of glasses, no sound of laughter echoing through the halls. Just silence. Heavy, sobering silence. I stood at the same window where I'd spent so many Christmas mornings staring out at a snow-blanketed lawn, pretending I belonged. Only this time, I wasn't pretending. I wasn't hoping to be invited into the inner circle or wondering if my stocking would be hung this year. I wasn't waiting for Callum to reach for my hand beneath the table. No. I was here, fully aware of what I'd done, what I'd exposed, and what I was walking away from. I turned slowly and faced the room. Margaret sat stiffly on the edge of her favorite armchair, dressed in a pale gray sweater set instead of her usual commanding red. Her makeup was thinner, barely covering the strain that pulled at the corners of her mouth. She looked older this morning. Not just tired, defeated. Janelle and Lydia were nowhere to be seen. They'd gone upstairs last night after yet another round of arguing, each carrying their own disappointment like it was something they'd just found tucked inside one of Margaret's perfectly wrapped gift boxes. And Callum, he was standing in front of the fireplace, gazing up at the mantel. The family photos were still arranged carefully across it: beach vacations, graduation ceremonies, Christmas mornings from years past. I wasn't in any of them. Not once. 6 years of marriage, and I'd never earned a frame. He didn't turn as I approached. He just stood there, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders stiff. Couldn't sleep? I asked quietly. He shrugged. Didn't try. I nodded. Neither did I. He turned to me finally, his eyes tired but searching. You were planning this all year? I was preparing, I corrected. There's a difference. I thought you were happy, he said, almost accusingly. You never said you weren't. I laughed then, low and hollow. Callum, I told you 100 different ways. You just didn't want to hear it unless I screamed. He looked down at his hands. I didn't think it was that bad. No, I said. You didn't think at all. Every time I told you about how they treated me, you waved it off. Every time they skipped me in the family photos or left me out of a gift exchange or made some snide comment, you told me not to take it personally. But Callum, how much more personal could it get? He didn't have an answer. I walked to the center of the room, where last night's chaos still lingered in the form of abandoned gift wrap, an overturned chair, and the folder that had changed everything. I picked it up, flipped through the first few pages, then set it on the coffee table one last time. Robert's filing for divorce, I said. Callum's head snapped up. He called Janelle this morning. Said the betrayal cut too deep. He's already contacted a lawyer. He's done. He looked stunned, but not surprised. She's going to lose everything. She already has. He moved toward me then, slowly, uncertainly. What about us? I inhaled sharply. There is no us. Don't say that. I met his gaze and reached into my coat pocket. My fingers closed around the ring, a simple gold band, the one he'd slipped on my finger in a moment of trembling vows and wide-eyed promises. Back when I thought he'd fight for me. Back when I believed love alone would be enough. I pulled it out and placed it into his open palm. He stared at it like it had turned to ice. You were never on my side, I said softly. Not even once. That's not true. It is. I didn't need to raise my voice. Truth didn't need volume. You laughed with them when they laughed at me. You stood back when they cut me out of the photo. You told me to be quiet when I tried to defend myself. You chose peace over me every single time. And now? You're shocked that I finally spoke louder than your silence. He looked like he wanted to reach for me, like his fingers itched to fix something he never understood. But I stepped back. Margaret scoffed from across the room. Don't be dramatic. I turned toward her. I burned your legacy down in less than an hour. Her eyes narrowed. You think you've won something? I tilted my head, calm and poised. I won myself back. She rolled her eyes, but I could see it, the tremble in her fingers, the thin edge of panic behind her snide tone. Her empire had fallen, and there was no performance left to hide behind. I don't need your acceptance, I said to her. I never did. But I wanted my husband's support, and he couldn't give me that. Callum stepped forward. I made mistakes. No, Callum, I interrupted, voice low and steady. You made choices. And I finally made one of my own. Silence followed. Real silence. Not the polite, stiff kind that wrapped around holidays and kept the family secrets buried. But a final, conclusive silence, the kind that signaled the end of something that had been rotting for a long time. I reached for my coat. Where will you go? Callum asked. I already went, I said. The moment I chose truth over performance. I've been gone a long time, Callum. I just needed the courage to walk out the door. No one stopped me. Not Janelle. Not Lydia. Not Margaret. Not even the man I'd promised to love for the rest of my life. Because they all knew. I left the Westridge estate with nothing but my coat, my dignity, and a strange sense of lightness. Behind me, the house loomed like a monument to the illusion I'd tried to fit into. But now I saw it for what it really was, a hollow palace dressed in holiday glitter. A kingdom ruled by silence and manipulation. Robert survived, but his marriage wouldn't. Margaret would lose her company, her reputation, everything she'd fought to preserve through deceit. And Callum would try to reach out in the coming weeks. He'd send texts. He'd leave voicemails. But I wouldn't respond. Because by then, I'd be long gone. And I wouldn't be looking back. Rose Bay was quiet in December, the kind of quiet that didn't press against your chest, but gently wrapped around your shoulders like a soft, familiar shawl. The town sat along the coast, sleepy and understated, its charm tucked into weathered cottages, flickering lanterns, and the scent of salt lingering just above the snow. It was a place people passed through in the summer, but forgot in the winter. Which, to me, made it perfect. The apartment I found was small, just 3 rooms and a little balcony that overlooked the ocean. Nothing fancy. No granite countertops or marble floors. Just warmth. I painted the kitchen cabinets a soft sage green and bought curtains from a thrift shop that reminded me of my grandmother's old house. Everything here was chosen with intention, not image. No one was watching. And for the first time, I wasn't performing. That first week in Rose Bay, I slept better than I had in years. No nightmares, no tension in my shoulders. Just peace. My body, once clenched with invisible restraint, slowly began to loosen. My muscles softened. My breath deepened. I felt like I was learning how to live again, not for appearances, not for Callum, not for survival, but for myself. I started walking every morning. Down the winding path that curved past the lighthouse, through the driftwood trail where pine met sea, and back again. Some days I didn't bring my phone. I didn't want to be reachable. I was still learning the sound of my own voice without everyone else's echo in my ears. By mid-December, my apartment was dressed in small, humble touches of the season. Handmade snowflakes hung in the window, each one unique, cut with scissors late at night over cups of peppermint tea. I strung white lights along the banister of my little porch and placed a tiny evergreen tree by the front window, its branches adorned with cinnamon sticks, dried orange slices, and a single strand of garland. No perfect color scheme. No designer ornaments. Just me, and what felt right. My new neighbors didn't ask many questions. Rose Bay wasn't the kind of place that pried. When I introduced myself at the local bakery, the woman behind the counter smiled, handed me a chocolate croissant, and said, "Fresh start, huh?" I nodded. She winked. "We like fresh starts here." And I believed her. I hosted my first Christmas dinner the following week. Nothing big, just 4 people. Eliza, the watercolor artist who lived upstairs and talked to her plants like old friends. Daniel, a retired high school teacher who'd brought over lemon scones when I moved in. And a young couple from across the hall, June and Mason, who were both nurses and worked alternating shifts. They brought board games and a bottle of wine. We laughed over burnt sweet potatoes and mismatched cutlery. We didn't talk about careers or reputations. No one asked about my past. They just showed up. And stayed. I realized, as we passed dishes and refilled glasses, that this was the kind of gathering I'd always hoped for during the Westridge years. Not a picture-perfect tableau, but a table of souls who wanted to be together. There were no cameras. No competition. No silent judgments floating under the tinsel. Only warmth. Only honesty. After everyone left that night, I curled up on the couch with a blanket and stared at the little tree by the window. Snow was falling outside, thick and gentle, the world blanketed in softness. I didn't cry. Not exactly. But I felt something release inside me. Like all the years of holding my breath had finally ended, and I could exhale. I remembered how Margaret used to refer to me as her. Not by name. Never by title. Just her. As in, is she bringing something? Or her taste is different. I used to ache for her approval like it would save me. But standing in the stillness of my Rose Bay living room, I realized how small that need had become. It was a grain of sand now, barely noticeable, washed away by time and salt air. Callum had reached out a few times. A voicemail, a text, another voicemail, each more hesitant than the last. He never apologized directly, just vague messages about how things ended strangely and how he still cared. I listened to the first one out of curiosity. I deleted the rest. He hadn't chosen me when it counted. He hadn't stood between me and the fire. And when the flames rose, he acted shocked that I walked through them alone. I wasn't angry anymore. Just done. In Rose Bay, I had found something better than apology, freedom. And with it, a new tradition. I wrapped my own gifts that year, all in brown paper and twine. No gold foil. No glitzy tags. Just simple packages for people I'd come to care about. A sketchbook for Eliza. A journal for Daniel. Homemade truffles for June and Mason. And one small box for myself, a pair of delicate silver earrings I'd admired in the town boutique. I wore them on Christmas morning, standing in my kitchen in fuzzy socks and a robe, brewing cinnamon coffee. There were no expectations. No performative joy. Just quiet, intentional celebration. That night, I lit a single candle and opened the windows just a crack. I stood barefoot on the wood floor and listened to the sea humming in the distance. The cold air kissed my skin, and for a moment, I closed my eyes and let myself feel the fullness of it all. I had made it through the storm. And now, I was building something entirely my own. I didn't have to be the outsider anymore, not here. In this place, with these people, I wasn't overlooked or edited out. I was remembered. Because this time, I had remembered myself. That was the greatest gift of all. And unlike anything that came wrapped in a ribbon, no one could take it from me. It was snowing again. Thick, heavy flakes drifted from the sky like feathers shaken loose from some ancient winter coat. The air outside smelled like pine and sea salt, and the breeze carried the faint echo of carolers from a few streets over, their voices distant and sweet. Inside my little apartment in Rose Bay, everything was still. Peaceful. The kind of quiet that no longer felt empty. The Christmas tree glowed softly in the corner, dressed in its simple ornaments, dried oranges, cinnamon sticks, twine stars. The lights blinked gently, casting shadows that danced across the floor. I curled up on the couch with a warm blanket wrapped around my legs and a mug of mulled wine nestled between my palms. Eliza's handmade candle flickered on the windowsill, sending out notes of clove and vanilla that wrapped around the room like a lullaby. 1 year. A full year had passed since the night everything had shifted. I didn't think about Westridge much anymore. When I did, it was like remembering a place I'd visited once and didn't care to return to, a cold museum filled with broken exhibits and velvet ropes. I had closed that door, literally and figuratively. Still, on nights like this, when the air held that particular kind of stillness only Christmas Eve brings, the memories returned, not to haunt me, but like quiet visitors knocking once, then walking on. That night at Westridge had broken something, yes, but it had also freed something else. And I'd built a new life from the ashes, slowly, gently, with hands that no longer trembled from doubt. The knock came around 8:30 p.m. soft. Hesitant. I froze for a moment, caught off guard. I wasn't expecting anyone. Most of my neighbors were at the Lighthouse concert or home with family. I set my mug down and walked to the door, opening it cautiously. No one was there. Just the snow and the scent of the ocean and a single white envelope resting on the welcome mat. I looked up and down the hallway, but it was empty. The air buzzed with holiday stillness. No footsteps. No echoes. Just me and the envelope. I bent down and picked it up. There was no name on the front, no return address, only my address written in neat, deliberate handwriting. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, suddenly aware of how loud the silence had become. Back on the couch, I turned the envelope over and opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded letter. Dear, my name. I know this is unexpected, but I hope you'll accept this letter in the spirit it's written, not as an intrusion, but as a quiet thank you. I'm not proud of how long it took me to open my eyes. When you handed Margaret that box last Christmas, I thought you were tearing our family apart. But the truth is, you were the only one willing to stop pretending. You didn't destroy anything. You revealed what was already broken. I paused, heart beating a little faster. The handwriting was familiar. Steady, precise. Formal, but heartfelt. I wanted you to know that I followed through. I filed the papers 2 weeks after the holiday. The process has been hard. But I'm alive. And I feel more awake now than I have in years. I've started volunteering at a shelter. I go on walks again. I even bought a dog, a ridiculous little thing named Percy who chews my shoes but insists on curling up beside me every night. More than anything, I want to thank you for waking me up. I didn't know how asleep I'd been until you forced me to see what I refused to acknowledge. For decades, I mistook routine for devotion. I confused Margaret's control for care. And I ignored the voices around me, especially yours, because silence felt safer. I blinked. My eyes were stinging, and I hadn't noticed until that moment. I hope you are happy now. Truly. Wherever you are. I heard you moved to Rose Bay. Good choice. I've been there once, long ago. Quiet place. Honest. Merry Christmas. Thank you for saving my life. Robert. I folded the letter slowly and held it in my hands for a long time, staring at the creases, the ink, the place where his pen had pressed harder on certain words. It wasn't long. It wasn't flowery. But it was real. And somehow, that made it the most valuable thing I'd received in years. I let the words settle inside me like snowfall, soft, steady, covering old wounds in fresh white stillness. Somewhere in a rented apartment, Margaret sat alone. That much I had heard. Word of her business's closure had reached me a few months back through a mutual acquaintance who didn't know we were no longer speaking. Her boutique catering brand had been dissolved. Licenses revoked. Reputation unsalvageable. She'd been forced to sell the Westridge estate. Downsized to a condo near the city. Callum had tried again, 2 emails, then silence. He was still blocked. Not out of anger, but for peace. There are some doors that, once shut, must stay closed. His silence was an answer in itself. And I no longer waited for men like him to choose me. I had chosen myself. And this letter, was confirmation that truth had not destroyed everything. It had simply cleared the space for something better to grow. I stood and walked to the window, pressing my fingertips to the cold glass as snow continued to fall over the street, softening the world in its quiet beauty. In nearby apartments, lights flickered. Laughter echoed faintly. A dog barked. My apartment smelled of cinnamon and pine. My cheeks were flushed from the wine and the warmth. My chest, once tight with grief, now felt open. Spacious. At peace. There were no forgotten gifts under the tree this year. No ignored place cards or whispered jokes. There was no seat just out of frame, no stocking missing from the mantel. Because this year, I wasn't waiting to be remembered. This year, I had remembered myself. The clock on the wall struck 9. Somewhere, a carol played faintly through someone's speaker. I recognized the melody, "O Holy Night," the notes rising and falling like a lullaby for the brave. I didn't need more closure. I didn't need applause. I had the snow. I had the sea. I had peace. And this, finally, was the Christmas I deserved.